Luke 10, verse 20. And who is my neighbor? Who were our neighbors in the East and West reserves? There were the English Métis, the French Métis, Anglo-Ontarians, Anglo-Americans, Germans, the French, the Ojibwe, Ukrainians, and Icelandic, all in their own way living in block settlements. Let's take a look at the English Métis first. Already by 1853, with a dwindling fur industry, population pressures in the river lot system in the Red River settlement came to a crisis. Archdeacon William Cochrane of the Church of England led a group of English-speaking Métis westward. Cochrane purchased several thousand acres from the local Saulteaux chief for the first agricultural settlement west of Red River. The purchase price was £10 sterling in trade goods. During the visit of some of the Mennonite delegates to Portage la Prairie, they encountered farmers on homesteads, and some of the delegates stayed overnight in the home of an Irish settler. Delegate David Claus in particular was pleased with the land, the existing farms and milling operations. The large influx of Anglo-Americans was starting to move towards Portage la Prairie and westward. French Métis. To the north and east of the East Reserve was a series of Francophone parishes along the Seine River. While the Wolseley Expedition Militia were given land grants of 160 acres, many of the Métis were having their land taken away by the corrupt Métis scrip system, resulting in mass exodus out of Manitoba. The rugged 1873 Dawson Trail saw its first 300 settlers arriving from the east. It was the same year some of the Mennonite delegates overnighted at the nearly completed Hudson Bay store in the parish of St. Anne, with a population in 1870 of 323 souls. It was from here that the delegates traveled to the Clear Spring settlement and observed the land conditions. One of the wives even communicated to them in German. In St. Anne in 1870 had a mostly Métis population of 287, with about 20 from Quebec, 8 who had been born in the United States, and another 8 residents who had come from the British Isles. St. Anne was likely the first settlement outside of the Red River settlement with Métis families building homes in the early 1850s, prior to the settlement of Portage la Prairie. With major bigotry against Métis, many of those who stayed blended into the Catholic French parishes. Now we'll take a little closer look at the Anglo-Ontarians, the Orangemen. Many of these arrived in Winnipeg and lived in the Anglo parishes. However, there was a pocket which had moved westward to take up life as farmers and those who were involved in the agricultural industry set up in Portage la Prairie. This transplanted bedrock of Ontario British Protestantism was forever to change the demographics of Manitoba. The religious nature of St. Mary's La Prairie Church of England changed with the sudden influx of Anglo-Saxon, Presbyterians, Baptists, and Methodists from eastern Canada. In 1870, the population had reached 337, consisting of 35 former residents of the British Isles, 251 English Métis, 7 Americans, and a few others. By the time the Mennonites in 1875 had arrived in the West Reserve, the surge of Ontario Anglos was well underway. By the spring of 1882, the population of Portage had swelled to 3,500, with a major land boom taking place. Portage la Prairie became the heartland of the Orange Lodge. It was from here the Fighting Joe Martin MLA for the riding until 1892 led his barrage against the French language instruction in schools and in support of the Catholic separate schools, which resulted in the Manitoba school question crisis. With over time, this also impacted on the Mennonites and their German private schools, leading to the mass exodus of any ethnic religious groups out of Canada in the early 1920s. Another community was the Clear Spring settlement. Some had come independently while others took up the Wolseley script homestead lands, which was known as military bounty grant. Some had previously worked for the Hudson Bay Company. By 1874, when the Mennonites arrived in the East Reserve, there were already 23 farms occupying quarter sections of land, as per the Dominion Lands Act of 1872, including this site here. Here they built a school, a church, and a cemetery in 1879. The Clear Spring settlers were the first to sell extra wheat to Winnipeg. Later in the 1890s, a community sprung up around the railway known as Steinbeck Station, later named Giroux, which in the early days was the key link for the Mennonites, Métis, and French settlers in the area. The settlement of Morden in the West Reserve was named after L.V. Morden, an early settler. The town was founded in 1882 when the CPR built a rail line there because of the water that was there for the rail steam engines. The Anglo-Americans were also a considerable number moving northward to settle. A group of investors saw an area around Emerson as being ideal, as it was the gateway by trail and river onto the Red River settlement. And with proximity to the border, it was seen as having strategic value for the development. After acquiring 2 townships east of the Red River, they promoted settlement and commercial development. Later, the more marginal lands within the parklands to the east were sold by the Americans to arriving Ukrainians. These Anglo-Americans were soon joined by Ontario Anglos around Dominion City and to the Roseau River and as far east as Stewartburn. While some of the lands around the Roseau River were Métis and First Nations, it was low land, prone to flooding. A number of drainage projects occurred, following which it opened up large American-owned bonanza farms around areas like Arnaud, operating until the late 1900s. These lands were broken up, were sometimes purchased by second-generation Mennonite farmers from the East and West Reserve. The major centers were Dominion City, Emerson, and smaller communities like Green Ridge and Ridgeville. The Germans. The 1870 census showed little evidence of Germans in Manitoba. However, you start to see immigration to North America in the 1870s. As conditions started to deteriorate in the Valhallan settlements of the Austrian-Hungarian lands in the Ukraine. Starting in the early 1890s, small closed settlements popped up across the prairies. These little enclaves appeared near Emerson, Gretna, Morris, Green Bay, Grunewald, and Talberg. These groups were nearly all German Lutheran, with a few Baptists. The larger Friedensfeld settlers arrived in 1891-92, just south of Steinbach. Speaking the German language in common with the Mennonites, they conducted business in Steinbach, and by 1900 they had grown to several hundred, and the proximity between the two groups and common language led in a number of cases to intermarriage. The French. The census of 1870 show a smattering of settlers in Manitoba, mostly in Métis-speaking parishes. The Francophones first arrived in the late 1700s as fur traders. They were the largest majority of the population till the mid-19th century. Many of these arrivals married according to the custom of the country, common law relationships with First Nations, which helped to also seal trading relationships. In the census of 1871, there were around 5,500 Francophones in Manitoba, who for the most part were Métis. Francophones did arrive from both France and Quebec, living in the French-speaking communities. The prominence of the Catholic Church brought new arrivals, mainly from Quebec. Since the establishment of Manitoba, there were occasional arrivals from Quebec, New England, and France. From the 50% Francophone speakers of 1870s, 2 decades later, the French only represented 10% of the population. The expansion of Anglo-Ontario had won. The Catholic Church in Quebec, for the most part, rather than watered down linguistic numbers when populations pressures occurred along the St. Lawrence, pushed people living there to move north rather than west. The French quickly lost their language rights in Manitoba, and shortly after World War I, ethnic groups which taught different languages in their private schools also found them being closed. The First Nations. When the Mennonites arrived in 1874, most of the First Nations had been pushed off the land to reserves. The 7 First Nations of Treaty 1 were part of this group. There were still a few independent groups around Fort Dufferin and the Pembina Hills, but soon they too were rounded up and placed on reserves. The reserves found within the East and West Reserve consist of the Buffalo Point First Nation and the Roseau River Anishinaabe First Nation. Ukrainians. The arrival of the Ukrainians in Manitoba in 1891 consisted of scouts who also toured parts of Saskatchewan and Alberta looking for potential settlement areas. They were discouraged wherever there was a lack of trees. They saw trees essential for firewood and for building. But they had to move on after they couldn't find settlement to Alberta. But later, they came again, and the Ukrainians stopped the immigration. 7 families started to arrive in the Gretna area, but they left. The settlement around Gardenton became known as the Four Corners Settlement, with settlers from Bukovina. While these Ukrainians differed from those of the eastern Ukraine, which the Mennonites were familiar with, both groups were often able to communicate in Ukrainian and German. Settlement in this district fell under the Dominion Lands Act, where through hard labor you could gain ownership of 160 acres of land. The Icelandic people around the town of Piney, centering in Township 1, Range 12 and 13 east of the principal meridian, was a small Icelandic settlement. Arrival here began in 1898 and 1899, mainly from Argyll and Mouse River. By 1900, it had reached a population of 100. Those were our neighbors up until 1900.